Many young athletes struggle with discipline, consistency, and accountability. But what many young athletes don't know is that something as simple as setting goals is scientifically proven to increase your consistency and your performance. I am thrilled to be working with the company Sports Hogs. It is a family-run company that specializes in making journals where you can track your process goals. Each journal, here's mine for basketball, gives you an opportunity to list your goals, how you want to implement them, and then gives you opportunities to not only reflect on goals in your workouts, but also reflect on each game performance over the course of the season. My favorite part of these Sports Hogs journals is the space where you as an athlete can list positive affirmations to keep yourself motivated. And if you need a little extra positivity, there are great quotes from legendary athletes filled in the journal. This family did an outstanding job creating resources for young athletes all over the country. And if you want to take advantage of this resource, visit sportshogs.com. That's sportshogs.com. Get a hand on your journal today. Greetings, information superhighway. Welcome to episode 17 of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. That's right. This podcast can now legally drive in all states. How exciting. We haven't really gotten the road test done yet, but that's neither here nor there. I am very, very excited about the interview we have. We are hitting the home stretch of the first season of this podcast, and we have covered so much ground. Before we get to the ground I want to cover today, quick check-in. Not on the Mets, but tangentially on the Mets. The Dodgers and the Yankees are currently warming up for Game 4 of the World Series as I record this. And the Yankees are playing tonight to avoid a sweep. And this makes me feel even better as a Mets fan, because now I am realizing in real time that the Mets really displayed a Herculean effort to get 2 games from the Dodgers in this series. The Dodgers are unbelievable. We're talking about one of the best offensive rosters ever assembled in baseball. I mean, if they get a runner on base, they're going to score, which is a pretty difficult thing to play against. So I'm even happier and more excited about the future of the Mets. And, hopefully I come back this time next week and the Yankees have pushed this to a 7-game series, but I just don't get the feeling that's in the cards. The Dodgers are just that buzzsaw. Now on to the recruiting stuff. Rather than give a sort of question of the week or address a specific recruiting issue or tell a recruiting story, I want to address why today's podcast is happening with today's guest before I talk about today's guest. So I have been fortunate to have a couple pieces of content resonate with, 100,000 or more people, which has been a really cool adventure, especially on Instagram, but it's also opened me up to some feedback that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Here is something that has been interesting to experience, not only just from the, community of people engaging on social media, but specifically from a community of high school athletes and their parents. For whatever reason, when we talk about basketball at a high academic level, there is immediately a stigma placed on that basketball product that the athletes don't work as hard on the court and that they're not as well coached. Now, I tried to dispel this myth a lot of ways as we progressed in this season. We had some great coaches that had affiliations with high academic basketball, both on the men's side and the women's side to this point of the podcast. We did a special D3 focused podcast with Mo Green, who specifically talked about high academic basketball. And then we did a D3 myth busting episode with 2 great high academic coaches, Sean Smiley and Zach Filzen from Fredonia and Bethel, respectively. So I thought we had sort of most of these bases covered. And then something really interesting happened. I put up a piece of content explaining that not all Division I opportunities are created equal. Obviously, if you're playing at the Power 4 level and dealing with a staggeringly higher amount of NIL money than low major and mid-major D1, not only are you going to have a different playing and equipment experience at that level, but if we flip it and you're at the lower level of D1, you might not realize that there is this Venn diagram where there's actually a real good-sized chunk of Division II that's putting more resources into basketball with better facilities and in often cases better fitting institutions than the bottom of D1. And that comment resonated with a lot of people, specifically a lot of people that had positive D2 experiences. But it also, for whatever reason, dragged the Ivy League into the fray, which didn't make a ton of sense to me. And I started getting these comments that were like, well, I mean, I feel like all D1 is D1 except for the Ivy League. Everyone knows the Ivy League's not really D1. And I started asking, this is, by the way, huge mistake on my part, engaging with strangers on social media. That is the equivalent of a social media flagrant foul. You should not do that. But I did it, and I'll own it. So I started asking strangers on social media, like, what do you know about Ivy League basketball? And it turns out that they know very little. So before we really dive into Ivy League basketball today, a quick background. The Ivy League is at a gargantuan competitive disadvantage at the Division I level for two key reasons. One, they do not have summer workouts the way that most Division I programs do. That's across the Ivy League. And two, as these major rules have come into play about extra eligibility years and transfer years and honoring graduate school, the Ivy League has put a cap on 4-year eligibility. So this idea of someone grad transferring, and helping a school get to the next level doesn't happen at the Ivy League. You'll see one of the best players in the Ivy League playing at UConn this year, and one of the best players in the Ivy League last year finished her career at USC. We're actually talking to her previous coach today. Segue alert. So the Ivy League has this constant competitive disadvantage in flux. So you'd think like, oh, yeah, well, that's because they take academics more seriously. Well, they obviously don't hoop. Wrong. The Ivy League beats so many teams, including teams in the Power Four. On the men's side, Yale beat Auburn. That Auburn in the NCAA tournament. We've had Ivy Leagues make Sweet 16 runs. Princeton won a couple games on the women's side. Columbia went to the finals of the WNIT and lost in a sold-out Kansas arena to Kansas. These teams are competing at the national level, and they're also pumping out like, neurosurgeons and astrophysicists. It's the best of both worlds. And I really, really wanted to myth bust the Ivy League, especially as I talked to more and more people that were like, yeah, I could go D1. I could sneak into an Ivy League school without realizing the Ivy League's recruiting against the ACC and the Big East. It's pretty serious stuff. So to unpack the Ivy League, I reached out to, in my opinion, one of the best young coaches in the country, who I've had the opportunity to see work with her team and work with some recruits and campers behind the scenes. When I was younger in my coaching career and wanted to learn more, I reached out to a bunch of Ivy League schools just looking to learn and work camps and see how they did things. And one program that was really receptive to me was Columbia women's basketball. I met the Columbia women's basketball staff, at least the core of them, head coached by Meg Griffith in, I want to say this was 2016. Flash forward 8 years later, and some interesting things has happened. Okay. First thing, Columbia just went to the first NCAA tournament in the history of their program. Coach Megan Griffith is now the winningest coach in Columbia women's basketball history after only 8 years of being there. She's been named the Ivy League Coach of the Year twice, the last 2 seasons of competitive play. They've competed for their first 2 Ivy League championships in 2 of the last 3 years. They have put out 2 WNBA draft picks in the last 2 years. They are consistently competing against the nation's best teams in their non-conference schedule to address some of those disadvantages that come with when you play in that Ivy League season and there's not a full drawn-out postseason and there's only 8 teams to play against. And right now, she sits as the head coach of Columbia, along with Princeton and Harvard, atop what has become a murderer's row conference of mid-major basketball, if you even want to call it that. So what's really important to me as someone who obviously wants to talk shop, talk X's and O's, talk building a program, but also talk about the recruiting process, what's really important to me is that you get the best information possible. It is mission critical to me that you understand what the Ivy League is all about. And Coach Megan Griffith is here with me today to talk about what the Ivy League is all about. You're going to learn so many really, really cool things in this podcast. First, you're going to learn how Coach Griffith's personal journey impacted her coaching philosophy at Columbia. You're going to learn all about what it means to play with an edge. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for that because it's really insightful and really motivating. You're going to learn how important it was for her and her longtime assistant coach, Ty Cordell, to build a staff and program in an image that reflected Manhattan. And you talk about intentionality. It was really, really awesome to hear the intention that went into putting things together with Columbia. And then in the second half of the interview, you're going to hear all about how she recruits, what her message to recruits is about how to be successful in the Ivy League, why that message intimidates some people who might realize the Ivy League isn't for them, and what she would do if she wanted to be a successful Ivy League student athlete now. There is so much in this interview, and I'm so excited for you to listen to it that we're going to dive in after one quick thing, which is, if you're watching this, you might notice that there's a microphone in front of my face. I made a boo-boo. I was so excited to catch up with Coach G that I forgot to put the microphone in front of my face. Whoops. So I spent a little bit of extra time salvaging the audio on my end, but you're going to notice a pretty drastic change in the way I sound once the interview with Coach Griffith starts. I'm going to ask that you forgive that. She sounds spectacular, not only her voice itself, but the content of what she's saying. So it's all on me, and I apologize for that. That said, this is a great interview that unpacks a lot of the myths about the Ivy League, why they exist, and what top Ivy League basketball really looks like. Enjoy it. Let's dive in.
I just always get excited because you have great energy, and I'm just always excited to talk to you. But you also are like my Manhattanite still. So how is life on the way Upper West Side, Coach Griffith?
It's been great. We've had some great fall weather. No, in all seriousness, it's, I love it up here, and I'm excited for the year. It's hard to believe this is where we are right now. Our first scrimmage is tomorrow, on the brink of a season. So it's an exciting time.
It's if I zoom out a little bit, I feel like It's been a very exciting time for Columbia women's basketball recently. And I love the X's and O's of basketball, but I also know that, you have a contagious energy, and we're all about the feels too. I have a couple of memories from last March, really etched into my mind, with one being like a full form tackle of Ty Cordell when it's announced that Columbia is heading to their first NCAA tournament. So I want to ask you about this because you are an alum of Columbia with coaching experience at another Ivy League school. You come back and you are now the winningest head coach in program history, and this program has achieved new heights. Can you walk me through what that must feel like for someone with such a deep connection to Manhattan and to this program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's so much. There's this enormous sense of gratitude I have just to be at Columbia. I mean, that's the first thing I always lead with is the people that I've been able to build this program with and grow. Tyler, you mentioned Tyler. We've been working together for 12 years, right? So for us to be able to reach this point in this program when it was something that was told that couldn't be done by a lot of people, friends and not, it was just, a kind of culmination of all the things that it was the ultimate form of delayed gratification. That's what I would say. Sorry for my I stumbled over myself a little, but it's, delayed gratification versus instant gratification. And for 8 years building something and to see it all come together in a way where, and we didn't even know that was going to happen, right? We didn't know. That's how genuine and authentic that reaction was. It's been unique. This process has been special. The journey has been very up and down, but But I'm immensely proud of what we've been able to build over time, and I just don't think we've missed any steps. That's what I'm most proud and grateful for.
This is something we talk to our players about a lot, is when it comes to growing, you can't skip any steps. I
Mm-mm.
imagine when you're kind of looking back on it, that makes it feel even more rewarding for you.
Definitely, definitely. That's the part. It's also the most humbling part of a journey, right? Is
Mm.
if you grow the right way, if you lay the foundation, and then you do, you're not thinking about the windows yet. You got to put the foundation and the bricks and make sure that everything is level and even. Then you start building, especially in a place that's never won before, right? Like I played here. Columbia's home for me, but there's been no winning tradition here. There've been no championships here, right? In Division I basketball. So to do something that's never been done, one, not only do you have to do it your own way, you can't follow this like blueprint. There is no blueprint. But to then be able to do something at home the right way, not miss a beat. Like I said, it's humbling, but it's also extremely rewarding, and it keeps you excited about the next thing, knowing there is another step.
I love that. And something that's really unique, having it's been very cool to know you and to watch this grow as you got your start there. Um, One of the things that I also have loved about this build for you is what appears, at least objectively, to be a very genuine relationship that you have built as a program with the city of Manhattan.
Hmm.
For listeners who don't really have an appreciation for this, there's the subway basically goes through Columbia. You're a one subway away from just about everything uptown, and you are starting to get great crowds. You're starting to get significantly more local investment. As someone that has spent so much time in Manhattan, can you describe what it's been like to have a team and a staff that is so bought into building a relationship with New York City?
Yeah, you got to be a New Yorker. If you're gonna be here, you gotta reflect the place that you are, right, or where you're living, or what you're trying to sell and advertise to people. And that's the thing, is that when we put together this staff, especially Ty and I, who've been together this whole time, that was our big thing. Is like we're gonna make our team synonymous with New York. We're gonna match it in terms of personnel. We're gonna match it in terms of the energy. Like there's just a different energy in New York City, and when we put the staff and team together, that was the intention, right? That's why people are like, why did you go international? And I'm like, because that's what New York City is. It's a melting pot, right? It's people from all over the world, cultures. Everybody looks different. Everybody's from a different part of the world. It's global. And you can also be yourself, and there's something for everybody here. So that's the thing I love the most about it, is when building that. In my experience as a student athlete, I also felt that no matter if you're winning or losing basketball games, the experience here is very real. It's very authentic. People are who they are through and through, and they find themselves. So that's something that I think our program has really taken ownership of, is that we're going to be a reflection of the city. We're going to be one with the city, but we have to get to know the city too. Like we can't impose ourselves on it. So the grassroots stuff, the civic engagement and community service is really important to our program, because we've been able to get to know our community as well. And that's allowed us to bring people in, right? The fact that, when I first took the job again, I could walk around anywhere, even just literally outside the gym or on campus, and nobody knew who like I was, who our players were. And, in the last 3 years, I'm on a train to Flushing Meadows to watch the US Open, and somebody's like, "Hey coach, like great season. I went to the business school, like I caught your game this year." And I'm like, "What?" Like just so out of context. That's happening not just to me, but all of our players. Abby Shu graduates last year, arguably the most famous person on campus all year, right? So it's just special to see how, if you open your arms up to people in New York City, it's going to like swallow you up in return.
That is so awesome. And I can, I know I've shared this with you previously. Having family that's from there, it's
Mhm.
very cool to see your staff's approach, because I think that reciprocal energy is very much a Manhattan thing. It is
Totally,
a unique city where
totally.
if your energy is not, I'm putting myself out there, it's very easy to just be an ant in
Yep,
Manhattan and not be noticed and
yep.
walk
Just
by.
cruise by. Yeah.
Right.
Hmm.
But if your arms are out in Manhattan, the city embraces you, and it's just so
Totally,
cool to see that.
totally.
You, on the subject of having some international flair to your team, you also played internationally after
Hmm.
your collegiate career. Something that really impressed me about your staff when I first got to know you working camps way back when was the way that you guys worked players out individually. And it looked like it was done pro style.
Mhm.
Something that I talk to a lot of young recruits about is the intention, or frankly, coach, the lack thereof
Mhm.
when they do workouts. And
Mhm.
as I've seen your program develop, one of my kind of hypotheses was their work behind the scenes is really intentional and really deliberate on position. And their staff is filled with people that are really looking at very specific details of what they do. And I've always wondered, now I have the platform to ask you this publicly, um, does some of your professional experience sort of influence what the work looks like for your individual athletes behind the scenes?
Definitely. It's unique. When I grew up, I did some like one-on-one personal train a little bit. Like it wasn't this big thing that it's become now. So I didn't have like a trainer. I did camps and I would work out with somebody like down the street basically that was a phenomenal mentor to me, but it wasn't like the most consistent thing. I was doing it maybe once every couple weeks. So and I loved the game and I loved sports, but I just don't think it was as ubiquitous as it is now in terms of training. Like it's just everywhere, right? But with me going overseas and really honing into my craft, one, I learned how to work hard and work with intention. Like I knew the difference between being in the gym for 2 hours and getting a good 45-minute workout in where I got better, right? And
Mm.
the efficiencies, I'm not, right now you can't see I'm 5 foot, I'm 5'5", right? So I'm not 6 foot tall, I'm not 6'2", I'm not a big guard. I was a good athlete, but I wasn't like the best skilled player. I knew that I had to get my inches in other places. So I had to figure out what those were. And when I went overseas, I actually had a lot of different coaches. One of my coaches was really great just in terms of being a student of the game, and I got to really get into film study and learning systems and game planning with my staff. And everything that went along with that was how to put the ball in places for players, how to make people better, not just the way that, I knew how to make plays in college. Like that was something I always did as a point guard, but I just understood more like why you would do this in this situation. And then I just started studying it more, honestly. When I came back, that was the bridge for me between seasons was to train young students, right? Young athletes. And that's when I started really studying the
Mm.
game, the movements, the efficiencies, all that. So that experience was absolutely a blessing for me in this coaching career.
So I don't want to go super off script here, but something you said just kind of popped a thought into my mind, which is
Mm,
you have legit pros now coming out
mm-hmm.
of Columbia. I mean, you had two players that were drafted by
Yep.
WNBA teams. You have, an international 3-on-3 superstar.
Yep.
And is there a translation there? Do you think maybe like a goal now, big picture is, can we get athletes thinking a bit more critically about the minutia of what they do while they're in college?
Definitely. That's part of our recruiting message, right? I say to players that you come to Columbia women's basketball to train like a pro on the court, but train like a pro in the classroom as well. And you can really do both at a high level, but your priorities, your time management, all of that is just so critical in that process. Not just because you're an Ivy League school. Let's all remember we're an Ivy League school, one of the best institutions in the world, but because that's how intentional you have to be with your work if you want to be really special in your field, right? Whether that's basketball, whether that's science, whether that's econ, whatever it is, you have to be that intentional. So that's how we recruit. And like sometimes like that's too intense for people. I'm not gonna lie. But I've learned that it's way better to be honest and direct in that recruiting process, and so that people know what they're gonna get. Like we have open practices. I'm like, come watch a practice. You need to know what it's like, not just watch us on game day. Come watch us at practice when we aren't everything doesn't look perfect, right? We're not making every shot. It's not the fans, you're not getting caught up in the atmosphere, but you're seeing what we do and how much work that takes. So that's part of our recruiting message. Is like we want to recruit and coach pros.
On the subject of that recruiting message, I'd love it if you could help me out with a little bit of myth busting here.
Yep.
I don't think enough people understand what Ivy League basketball actually is. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and I obviously having followed your program, I know that you made a run to the championship of the WNIT, then the next season go to the NCAA tournament. And I also know that, most of your conference can go toe to toe with most schools in the country, regardless of their conference affiliation.
Mm-hmm.
what do you think is most misunderstood by like the average kid or average family about Ivy League basketball?
Well, I think the relevance in the grand scheme of Division One is the number one myth, right? Is because there's so many now that there's not even Power Five, there's Power Four. All of these teams got split up, the conference realignments. There's so many teams now in each one of these Power Four conferences. They just have more opportunity to be higher ranked, right? Because they're playing more teams of that caliber. The conferences aren't as spread out as it used to be. But the Ivy League sits literally right below them and the Big East. Us and the Big East are going head to head every year in terms of where we sit as a conference in the net rankings of college basketball. So for the Ivy League, like we're literally at the pinnacle of mid-major basketball and touching high major basketball. And the only thing that separates us is, like football, right? Basically, it's
Right.
that's just what it is. The bowl series, like our team, we don't compete in the bowl series, our football team programs. So that's why we aren't going to be a part of those Power Four football bowl series conferences. So, honestly, coming back to basketball for us, the net rankings is a big thing. It kind of tells you like it's like strength of schedule, how you do, how your opponents do when they go play other people, et cetera, et cetera. It's this big formula. Us, Princeton, Harvard, and Penn, like has all been in the top 100, top 150 the last 3 to 4 seasons, right? Us and Princeton have been in the top 25 of that in the last 2 seasons, right? So you're looking at programs that are we're not just telling you that we're one of the best in the country. We actually are one of the best in the country. And we have to prove that in November and December, because when we get into conference play, obviously we're all playing each other. We just don't have as many opportunities beyond January to do that. So that's one of the big fundamental differences, honestly. But our conference is really strong, especially in the women's basketball side. Our men's teams are also getting a lot better as well, top to bottom.
Yep. It's always interesting because, I'll post something about Division One or difference in divisions, and I'll always have somebody comment like, hey, not all Division Ones are created equal. Like you could end up at an Ivy League school. And I have to kind of respond like, yes, and that means might beat
You've won.
most of the high mid majors
You've
you
won
play.
at life.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And end up playing, in a sold out Kansas arena for a WNIT championship. Yeah.
Yeah.
What a
Exactly.
sad experience that would be.
Totally. It's I think that this NIL world we're in right now is also changing the way people are talking or thinking about the Ivy League, because I think people are assuming we're not being proactive in that space, right? I think it's just going to look really different. I can speak on behalf of our program, but pay for play is like a thing now, right?
Yeah.
And the Ivy League values don't necessarily align with that, but that doesn't mean we're not going to try to help our student athletes activate their name, image, and likeness while they're here, right? That's something that's very important to me. I know it's important to some of my counterparts, but there are absolutely opportunities that will be either paralleled or look different than what they're receiving at some of these other places. So I think the NIL space has really also changed the lens of like how people think about Division One basketball now.
That makes tons of sense. I have one final question for you before we dive into like the recruiting component of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something that always stood out to me, like the very first time I met you, was your talk to players and prospective student athletes about having an edge. And I know that you actually use EDGE as an acronym. And I think for anybody listening, would be really cool for them to hear your definition. So for Coach Megan Griffith, what does it mean to play with an edge?
Right. So, this is our mantra. It's our internal theme. It was something that was like, it's super sacred to me, but it's also something that we want people to know about because, there's a couple meanings behind it. When I came back to Columbia, I was like, we need one thing that's going to like be our thing and like something we talk about. It resonates with me. It resonates with you. And so we've defined it pretty clearly. I think the number one part is I've just always believed in having edges in life, right? People talk a lot about gaining inches in places, and that's how it's like compound interest, right? So for me, it's the same way. I look about having edges, and I was like that underdog mentality player, right? So that's the number one. So how we define edge for our players, it's energy, discipline, grit, and excellence. So energy, we say, is being a great teammate. And what does that look like, right? So being a great teammate means we have one shared ego, right? And that's really critical to us to understand that how we impact each other and how decisions affect one another. Discipline, we talk about owning choices, right? Ownership is just such an important accountability, and ownership right now is such an important part of your process and your growth process. And again, this domino effect of what I do affects you, Jared. What you do affects Ty, right? So, again, if we're going to be a team, we have to understand that grit is having a growth mindset. And with growth, feedback is inevitable. Failure is inevitable. We talk a lot about failing fast, right? Failing first, and then being able to fail forward and receiving that feedback and making adjustments with that. So we say feedback is our food. And then excellence, for me, how I define that and how we define it as a program, our staff, is being a player-led program, right? And that is the championship culture of Columbia women's basketball, is the Columbia Edge, is making sure that our players understand that this is their team. It's not our team, coach fed, player led. And you've heard this in so many different ways, I'm sure, anybody listening, but I really believe that is the secret ingredient, and why I really believe our team is number one in culture in the nation. Is because our players are really bought into that. It's their team and they take ownership. They make decisions. We empower them to do that, to have hard conversations with each other.
I love that. And to me, that's like the perfect segue now to talk about, well, how could somebody potentially become a member of your team and navigate the recruiting process? So you shared earlier that your honesty in the recruiting strategy could frankly be a little bit too much for somebody in terms of, hey, what we're asking for is a lot.
Totally.
I feel like, even though it's important to state that might not be unique, to you personally, because being an athlete in the Ivy League seems challenging from the outside looking in. So in your eyes, what does it take for a prospective student athlete to kind of clear your checkbox for, I know this kid is going to be successful as both a student and an athlete in the Ivy League?
I think it's different at each Ivy school. I do think we all have our own challenges, just like schools do in other conferences, right? So I think, one, you're going to get a fantastic education at any one of our institutions. I do really believe that. I mean, I was a student at Columbia. I've coached at another institution. I've coached here. So my lens is really focused on those two places. I think that you're going to be, one, tested in different ways because it's competitive in the classroom. That's the thing that you have to remember. I say this to our players. I'm like, everybody was a good student in high school, which is not always the truth, but like high school is so much easier than college because you go to class every day, right? For most part, like there's some block scheduling, and in college you go to class like twice a week, maybe. Sometimes there's classes that meet every day, introductory classes and things like that, but there's so much more time left up to your own device, and you've got to figure out how to manage that. So I would say, here, one, we take a lot of pride in not missing a lot of classes. So we don't have to like make things up a lot. But to be successful here at Columbia, I think there's going to have to be like your priorities are in order. And you have to remember the things you said you wanted early in the recruiting process are still the things that are important when it gets hard or when there's some decisions that you need to make. Right. So, but that's the one thing. But I mean, that's so hard to comprehend as a prospective student athlete. I think it's a mindset. I always say this place isn't for the perfect student. It's for the person that wants to really like work hard and be invested in their education here on and off the basketball court.
So really big on that engagement piece.
Yes, absolutely. They've got to interact with their growth. It's not, if you come here and just try to let things happen to you or just check the boxes, like that's not the kind of place Columbia is. Columbia is so hands-on and it's learning. That you've got to be willing to get your hands dirty. You got to be in it with other people, with your professors, with your other classmates, with us as your basketball staff and program.
Love that. So now we flip to specifically the basketball part, because we've already talked about the fact that, people sleep on the Ivy League when in reality, we're swinging with the heavyweights.
Yeah.
In women's college basketball. When you're out on the road and you're watching kids play, what are some of the things that you might see that, in a kid that you circle and turn to the rest of your staff and go, we got to keep an eye on this kid? What makes somebody a home run to you when you're out on the road?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, when I'm watching basketball, my big thing is, their ball skills, their level of ball skills is like, what can they do? Not just in terms of like shooting and like the statistical things, but how they can catch, pass, dribble, right? It's like, to me, having great hands, great feet are just so important in the college game. And because if you have a good base, you can grow further faster, right? It's like exponential growth you have those two things. But if you're a little clumsy or like you're just, again, not that we can't work with that, but having a solid base, I think, is really, really critical there from, like I said, hands and feet, but also ball skills in general. And then the other thing for us, like we recruit, the way we play, we recruit to our style. We play a very fast paced style, a lot of making decisions on the fly, quick thinking. So for me is like, when I'm watching a player, like what's their versatility like? How do they operate in different spaces, open spaces, tight spaces? Are they getting to the next read quickly? So that for us is important. And everybody on my team, like they all shoot the three, they all post up. It's all about reading the mismatch. So that's like the IQ thing, leaning into that, which means we watch a lot. Like my staff, I will give them so much credit. They watch a lot of video. They watch a lot, obviously in the summertime when we're all out and all the recruiting periods, but we do a lot of work behind the scenes too to make sure we know what we're getting.
I love that. And I think the IQ component in high school is one of the most slept on things, especially in modern times. Got a lot of young kids that you mentioned one-on-one training before. There's a lot of kids with great scoring moves, but they don't necessarily execute them at the correct time.
Totally.
And, I don't think enough kids realize they're being evaluated on the decisions they make and not necessarily the plays they make.
Totally. Decision making is huge. It's huge. It's like, yeah, you can rep something, but knowing when to do it, why to do it, how to do it that marriage is really critical.
So you just mentioned your staff's attention to detail and what they're watching for on the recruiting trail. Something I've known about your staff that I really, really love about them is their commitment to building authentic relationships with recruits during the process. I think a lot of young people do not realize how important the relationship building component of the process is as they navigate it.
Definitely.
I've tried to explain to some younger athletes that like you're going to spend a huge amount of time with your teammates and with your coaches. And like part of a coach protecting their investment is making sure that they can rock with you and that you're going to be able to take their coaching. So I'm curious to know, especially when it comes to your staff, are there specific things that you're sort of looking to learn about recruits as you build relationships with them? Like, or is it a bit more fluid from kid to kid?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fluid, right? Like you're going to go where the conversations take you but there's things for sure that we're like going to get to. Like we have very targeted conversations and we try to rotate the contacts we make because the way I talk to a player is very different than everybody else in my staff talks to a player, right? So we try to figure out, okay, like who are the major pieces of influence for this person, right? Is it the coach? Is it the mom or the dad? Is it the sister? Is it the brother? Who is it? Who's that person? So we always want to know who those major points of contact or influence are. But then too, like making the student athlete feel comfortable so they can like really tell us like what they're thinking. Because I think so much of recruiting right now is it's being fed to them, or it's like, hey, you should be thinking about this. And if you can really find out what's important to the student themselves, the student athlete themselves, I think that's a big win. Now that takes time, right? Like your conversations need to have substance. And then one thing too, we like really pay attention to is like how interactive are they with us? Like not just like that whole engagement piece, right? It's not just like, are they sending us email updates with their stats and all this stuff, or where am I'm playing on court 5, but asking questions about like who we are as people and what's important to us. And they've watched a game. Like to me, those are really critical steps in the process. And you don't always nail it with players. Like some people just are getting recruited by way too many schools, and that's overwhelming. But being able to make those decisions, sift through that, and be like, okay, these things align with me. We try to get to that quicker than as soon as possible, but it's hard. It's hard. There's a lot. Like we see everybody's at all the same events now. Like it's so different. Recruiting is so different. Like I never thought I would get a player to come to Columbia from Idaho. We have a player coming in from Idaho next year, right? So or like, some of the places, like the international places we recruit. We have a player from Estonia on our team right now. Like I remember like visiting Estonia when I was a player being like, they have basketball players here? Like you just, like, of course they do, but it's such a small country, and basketball there is really growing. So it's just unique when you start thinking about how your connections make sense, but just trying to get at, again, what's important to the student athlete, does that align with us, and then who is their circle of influence. I think those are the big things.
You just said something that's really, really interesting to me. And to me, I see some common ground with what you were talking about on the court with decisiveness. There are times when particularly when I was recruiting Canisius to the Sahara, I would know when I was talking to a recruit that was overwhelmed.
Yes.
Like someone that had really not thought about what they wanted yet and was just kind of taking calls from everybody. And then like you got
Totally.
on the phone with them and it was kind of just blank space. Is it fair to say that decisiveness that you want on the court, like people that can make a decision, that know when to do the right thing, is it fair to say that you're also looking for people that kind of know what they want out of their collegiate experience when they are communicating that to you?
Definitely. It's really hard. I would say right now it's so hard because I feel like it changes too with recruiting, right? Like they'll say, "Hey coach, like I want to go to the best possible school. I want to play at the highest level." And it's like I feel like we give those things the most, and then they go and pivot to X school that doesn't have the academic reputation maybe, right? So I just think there's so many more things in play, especially when players go on campuses, right? There's things that are going to tug at their heartstrings they probably didn't realize would. So it's like sometimes, you just try to, show them as much as you can and make sure your relationship means enough, but that's also not enough sometimes, it's
Right.
it's unique, but I would say decisiveness in recruiting, it's very rare that players like really know what they want early in the process, unless like somebody is very much guiding them and helping them through that.
I love what you just said about giving them the experience. A quick anecdote here, because I'm sure you've had something like this happen, where I would ask recruits, like, can you give me an idea of how you want to be coached? And I learned the hard way that like a very popular answer was not telling me the truth. It was like, coach, you can coach me however you want. I'm extremely versatile. I feel like you take any type of coaching.
Yep.
And in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, cool. But then I go out and actually do that. And I'm like, oh, they didn't mean that. They were saying that because they were at like
Totally.
the front of the classroom giving me the A+ answer.
Totally.
And your messaging is really important to me here because I don't think enough recruits realize that we need them to be honest, because even if we're not the right fit for them, they have a better shot at finding the correct fit for them by knowing what they want after having
Totally.
enough experiences and acting on it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's tough. I think that it's important that you remind them of the things they told you were important as well, and you continue to talk to those things. But also, I would just say to recruits listening or to prospective student athletes, like it's okay to tell people if this isn't something you like about a place, right? Like, or hey, I'm not sure about the city yet. Like we get that. Like, and then they come on campus and like, wow, like I had no idea this was like. And you're like, yes, like it's in a gated campus. And, there's obviously negative recruiting that happens from school to school at times, but I would just say like, see it for your own eyes. Don't believe it because it was told to you by somebody else. So, and that's the same that goes for coaches that are trying to recruit you too. It's like, make sure like if you're really interested in a place, like do your homework as much as you're going to be recruited. Don't just listen to what people are telling you. But again, like if that's what's important to you, make sure that it satisfies the needs that you have.
Especially based on what you just shared, this seems like a very good place to wrap. So my last question for you, let's say we have access, they probably have one of these at Columbia already. Let's say we have access to a time machine. And Megan Griffith is, back to being a junior in high school. She's decided she's all in on getting recruited and going to be a college athlete. Knowing what you know now, how would you jumpstart your recruiting process?
Oof. That's a good question. That's a tough one too. I would say right now, I would just have been way more serious about it. I probably, if I was in this generation and I was the same 17-year-old or 16-year-old that I was then now, I would have been one of those very overwhelmed players. Now, thankfully, my parents were really, I had really helping me, my dad specifically, like through the process and being like, Megan,
Sure.
you got to care about this. And he didn't tell me what to do, but he always just kind of made sure I put myself in the right position. So I would say with where recruiting has grown so much and how much more exposure there is, I would tell myself like get more serious about it earlier. It's cool to care, right? It's not cool to just field a lot of phone calls and like to your point, having those blank conversations, not having memorable relationships with people. So I would tell myself to hone in on that stuff a lot sooner. Take control of your recruiting process.
Awesome. To anyone listening that's in the metropolitan area, incredible women's college basketball is a quick subway ride away on the one uptown.
Take the one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, Coach Griffith. Really appreciate you.
Absolutely, Jared. Great to see you, buddy.
That's going to do it for another episode of the Nail the Recruiting Process podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. I hope you got something out of today's podcast. If you'd like to learn more about anything related to Nail the Recruiting Process, the book, my work, maybe wanting to work with me one-on-one, anything under the sun, you're going to visit www.nailtherecruitingprocess.com. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can follow me at Nail the Recruiting Process on Instagram or at Jared the Coach on Twitter and TikTok. Both of those handles are just one word, no characters, no spaces. If you'd like to ask something of me directly, if you'd like a question that maybe you want answered on a future podcast, or if you have an idea for something we should talk about in a future episode, please reach out to me via email. I would love to hear from you. My email address is recruitinggear@gmail.com. That's the word recruiting, then the word gear combined. recruitinggear@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we hope to catch you next time.